Chapter 1. The Letter from the West. The winter of 1848 in Boston was not merely a season, it was a sentence. It was a gray, suffocating blanket of coal smoke and Atlantic fog that clung to the cobblestones of Beacon Hill and seeped through the cracks of the draftiest boarding houses. For Elias Thorne, a 23-year-old clerk at the mercantile firm of Hemlock and Sons, the winter felt like a physical manifestation of his life, cold, predictable, and utterly devoid of color. Elias sat perched on a high wooden stool, his posture curved like a willow branch over the leather-bound ledger. The air in the counting house smelled of stale tobacco, dried ink, and the damp wool of Mr. Hemlock's overcoat, which hung by the door like the ghost of a drowned man. Scratch, tip, scratch. The rhythm of the steel-nibbed pen against the parchment was the heartbeat of his existence. He was tallying shipments of cotton and molasses, commodities that traveled the world, while he remained anchored to this stool, his fingers stained permanently black by the tools of his trade. He was a young man of sharp features and serious eyes, possessing a mind that was often too large for the small rooms he inhabited. He had followed the rules, as his father had before him. He had secured a respectable position, rented a respectable room, and wore a respectable collar that chafed his neck. But lately, a restlessness had taken root in his chest, a dull ache that grew sharper with every ship's horn that bellowed from the harbor. "Thorne," Mr. Hemlock's voice rasped from the shadows of his private office. "The manifest for the Lady Jane, is it complete?" "Nearly, sir," Elias replied, his voice sounding thin in the quiet room. "Just balancing the final column on the saltpeter." "See that it is done before the clock strikes 6. Diligence, Thorne. Diligence is the currency of the righteous." Elias suppressed a sigh. "Yes, sir." The heavy oak door at the front of the office creaked open, admitting a gust of freezing wind and a flurry of snowflakes that danced briefly on the floorboards before melting into dark spots. A boy, wrapped in a scarf so large it swallowed his face, stumbled in, clutching a leather satchel. It was the post runner. Usually the mail was a mundane affair. Invoices from suppliers in Liverpool, complaints from customers in Charleston, or stern directives from the bank. But today, the atmosphere shifted the moment the boy dropped the stack on the front counter. "Priority from the overland route, sir," the boy chirped, shivering. "Cost a pretty penny for the final leg." Mr. Hemlock emerged from his office, his spectacles sliding down his nose. He sorted through the pile with dismissive flicks of his wrist until his hand paused. He pulled out a thick, battered envelope. It looked nothing like the crisp white stationery of the merchants. This paper was brown, coarse, and stained with something that looked suspiciously like grease, or perhaps dried blood. It bore postmarks that were barely legible, stamps from places that didn't exist on the civilized maps Elias knew. "Thorne," Mr. Hemlock said, his tone laced with distaste, "it seems your brother has not forgotten you, despite his wild indiscretions." Elias felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He slid off the stool, his knees suddenly weak. He hadn't heard from Julian in over 14 months. Julian, the older brother, the dreamer, the one who had taken his small inheritance and vanished west toward the territories, while Elias stayed behind to be the responsible one. Elias took the letter. The paper felt rough like cured hide. It smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, a scent so alien to the coal-choked air of Boston that it made Elias dizzy. On the front, in Julian's chaotic, sloping handwriting, was written, "Mr. Elias Thorne, C.O. of Hemlock and Sons, Boston, Massachusetts." "Thank you, sir," Elias whispered. "Read it on your own time," Hemlock grunted, turning back to his office. "The saltpeter, Thorne." The next 2 hours were an exercise in torture. The numbers on the page swam before Elias's eyes. He made 3 errors and had to scrape the parchment clean with a razor, earning a sharp glare from the senior clerk. The letter burned a hole in his breast pocket. He could feel its weight against his heart, a heavy, silent promise. When the clock finally chimed 6, Elias didn't walk out of the office. He practically fled. He pulled his coat collar up against the biting wind and navigated the icy streets, his boots slipping on the slush. He didn't go to the tavern where the other clerks gathered to complain about their wages. He didn't go to the dining hall of his boarding house. He went straight to his small, unheated room on the 3rd floor, locked the door, and lit the single tallow candle on his bedside table. His hands trembled as he broke the wax seal. It wasn't a proper seal. It was a glob of pine pitch pressed with a thumbprint. He unfolded the paper. It was thick, likely purchased at a trading post for 10 times its worth. October 12th, 1848, somewhere on the American River, California territory. Dear Eli, if you are reading this, then the angels have favored the postwriter, and you are still sitting in that gray tomb of a city, rotting away one ledger line at a time. Stop, put down the pen, burn the ledger if you have to, but listen to me. You were right to call me a fool when I left. I know you said the West was a graveyard for dreamers, and for a long time you were right. I starved in St. Louis. I was robbed in Independence. I nearly froze to death crossing the Rockies. I have eaten things that would make a goat retch, and I have slept with one eye open for fear of bears and bandits. But Eli, I was wrong about the destination. I'm writing this from a tent in a place called Coloma. You won't find it on a map. It's wild country, beautiful and deadly. But the ground, Eli, the ground is alive. Elias leaned closer to the candle, squinting at the erratic handwriting. The ink seemed to have been mixed with soot. It happened at a sawmill owned by a man named Sutter. A fellow named Marshall found it first, but the secret couldn't be kept. It's in the water. It's in the sand. I swear on our mother's grave, I bent down to drink from the river 3 days ago, and I saw it shimmering there, staring back at me like the sun trapped under water. Gold. Pure, heavy, soft gold. I'm not talking about dust, brother. I'm talking about flakes as big as your nail. I'm talking about nuggets that sit in the pan like eggs in a nest. Men are pulling a year's wages out of the dirt in a single afternoon. The blacksmith here has a jar full of it. A jar. But here's the trouble. I'm alone. You know I have the strength of an ox, but I lack your head. The wolves are coming. Not the 4-legged kind, but the 2-legged kind. Deserters from the army. Sailors jumping ships in San Francisco. Scoundrels from every corner of the globe. They smell the money. It's lawless here. A man can find a fortune in the morning and have his throat cut by sunset. I have staked a claim up a tributary, a place hidden by a gorge. It is rich, richer than anything you can imagine, but I cannot work it and guard it at the same time. I need a partner I can trust. I need my blood. Sell my books. Sell the watch Father gave me. I left it in the trunk at Aunt Martha's. Sell everything. Buy a wagon, buy supplies, and get to Independence, Missouri before the spring thaw. Join a train. Do whatever you must, but come to California. I have enclosed a sample, just so you know I haven't lost my mind. Your brother, Julian. Elias frowned. Enclosed a sample. He shook the envelope upside down. Something small and heavy fell onto the wooden table with a dull thud. Elias froze. He reached out with a trembling finger and touched it. It was a rough, uneven lump, no larger than a pea. He picked it up. It was shockingly heavy for its size. He brought it close to the candle flame. The dull yellow metal caught the light and exploded into a warm, buttery glow. It was soft. When he pressed his thumbnail into it, it left a mark. It wasn't brass. It wasn't fool's gold. Pyrite was brittle and shattered. This was malleable. This was eternal.
gold. Elias sat back, the breath rushing out of his lungs. The room suddenly felt very small. The peeling wallpaper, the cracked wash basin, the cold draft coming from the window, it all seemed sharply, painfully insufficient. Elias looked at the gold again. That tiny piece of metal was worth more than he earned in 3 months at Hemlock & Sons, and Julian claimed there was a river full of it. Skepticism, his natural defense mechanism, tried to rear its head. Julian was prone to exaggeration. Julian was a gambler, but the gold was real. The weight of it in his palm was undeniable physics. It was a gravitational pull, dragging him away from the Atlantic and toward the Pacific. Elias stood up and walked to the window. Below, the gas lamps of Boston flickered in the wind. He saw men walking in huddled groups, heads down, bracing against the cold.
Chapter 2. Farewell to the Known World. The divestment of a life is a quieter affair than the building of one. It took Elias Thorne 23 years to accumulate the identity of a Boston gentleman. The books, the starched collars, the imported teacups, the quiet reputation for reliability. It took him less than 3 days to strip it all away. His room on the 3rd floor, once a sanctuary of claustrophobic comfort, now looked like the picked-over carcass of a strange animal. The floorboards were bare. The bookshelf, which had sagged under the weight of history and philosophy, stood empty, gathering dust in the pale winter light. Elias stood in the center of the room, holding the last item he couldn't quite bring himself to sell, a pocket-sized volume of Emerson's essays. It was dog-eared and stained with coffee, a companion through many lonely nights. But weight was the enemy now. Every ounce had to justify its existence in calories or protection. Philosophy would not feed him on the Platte River. With a heavy sigh, he dropped the book into the discard pile destined for the landlady. "That's the lot of it, then?" Mrs. Higgins asked from the doorway. She was a woman of formidable wit and skepticism, wiping her hands on a graying apron. She eyed Elias's travel attire with open disapproval. Gone was the worsted wool suit and the silk cravat. Elias now wore a pair of corduroy trousers, a thick flannel shirt that scratched his skin, and heavy boots that felt like lead weights on his feet. He had purchased a wide-brimmed felt hat that felt like a costume on his head. "That's the lot, Mrs. Higgins," Elias said. He patted his breast pocket. The gold nugget was there, wrapped in a handkerchief, sitting next to the terrifyingly large wad of banknotes he had acquired from the pawnbroker. He had sold everything: Julian's watch, his own silver cufflinks, his winter coat, even his bed frame. The sum came to $340. It was a fortune to a poor man, and a pittance for the journey ahead. "They say you're going to California," Mrs. Higgins said, shaking her head. "They say the whole world's gone mad. My sister's boy left yesterday. A baker he was. Doesn't know one end of a mule from the other." "It seems to be a common affliction," Elias replied, forcing a smile. "You'll come back," she predicted, crossing her arms. "When the gold runs out and the fever breaks, you'll all come back." "Goodbye, Mrs. Higgins." Elias grabbed his newly purchased kit bag, canvas reinforced with leather corners, and slung it over his shoulder. He didn't look back. Looking back was dangerous. It invited hesitation, and hesitation was a luxury he could no longer afford. The streets of Boston were usually orderly, governed by the ticking of the clock and the flow of commerce. But as Elias made his way toward the train station, he realized Mrs. Higgins was right. The world had gone mad. It was everywhere. The newspapers that boys waved on the corners screamed the headlines in bold black ink. "Gold, gold, gold! The placers of California! Untold wealth!" Shop windows that once displayed textiles and spices were now crammed with California kits. Hardware stores marketed pickaxes, shovels, and gold-finding machines that looked like contraptions of pure quackery. Every conversation Elias overheard as he navigated the slushy streets contained the words Sacramento, Sutter, or Nugget. The train station was a scene of pandemonium. It was a swirling vortex of humanity. There were men in rough-spun clothes shouting goodbyes to weeping wives. There were sharp-eyed men in suits who looked like they would rather steal a claim than dig one. There were groups of young men, arms linked, singing "Oh, Susanna" at the top of their lungs, drunk on whiskey and hope. Elias purchased a ticket for the first leg of the journey, a train to Albany, then a transfer to Buffalo. From there, the Great Lakes, and eventually the riverboats to St. Louis. It was a journey that would have been a lifetime adventure in itself just a decade ago. Now it was merely the commute to the starting line. He squeezed into a carriage, jamming his bag between his knees. The bench was hard wood, and the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco, and excitement. "Headin' for the diggins, friend?" The voice came from the man squeezed next to him. He was older, perhaps 40, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of driftwood. He wore a buckskin jacket that had seen better decades and chewed on a stem of unlit pipe tobacco. "Yes," Elias said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "California." The man chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Name's Silas Vane. I've been trapping beaver up in the Oregon Territory before you were breached. Heading back out because the beaver's gone and the gold's arrived. Easy trade, I figure." "Elias Thorne, clerk." "Clerk?" Silas looked at him up and down, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "Well, Elias the clerk, take a good look out that window." The train whistle shrieked, a piercing cry that signaled the end of waiting. The engine engaged with a violent lurch, throwing Elias against Silas. The wheels began to grind against the iron rails, slowly at first, then gathering speed. Elias looked out the window. The brick buildings of Boston, the church steeples, the smokestacks of the factories, they all began to slide backward. "Take a good look," Silas repeated softly, "because once you cross the Missouri, civilization is just a word in the dictionary. Out there, the only law is what you carry in your holster and what you can hold in your fist." Elias watched the city vanish, replaced by the white frozen fields of the Massachusetts countryside. He felt a sudden sharp pang of terror. He was leaving the world of laws for the world of survival. But then he touched the pocket where the nugget lay. It was still warm. The journey to the edge of the frontier was a blur of changing landscapes and hardening realities. By the time they reached Buffalo, Elias had learned to sleep sitting up, ignoring the roar of the tracks. He learned that the California fever respected no class boundaries. In his car alone, there was a minister who had abandoned his flock, a bankrupt lawyer fleeing his debts, and a farmer who had sold his land to chase a rumor. They were all Argonauts now, a brotherhood of the desperate. The steamer across Lake Erie was a nightmare of gale-force winds and seasickness. Elias spent 2 days retching over the rail, watching the gray waves batter the hull. But he didn't complain. He observed. He watched how Silas Vane moved, economically, never wasting energy. He watched how the gamblers in the saloon cheated the greenhorns. He began to learn the language of the road. From the Great Lakes, they took the canal boats and then the mighty steamboats down the river systems. The further west they went, the rougher the world became. The clean-shaven faces of the East gave way to beards and scars. The polite conversation was replaced by loud boasting and cursing. And then, finally, after weeks of travel that left Elias bruised, battered, and coated in a permanent layer of grime, they arrived. St. Louis. It was the gateway, the last bastion of the East before the great unknown. As the steamboat, the River Queen, churned her way toward the levee, Elias stood on the upper deck. The sight that greeted him was overwhelming. The riverfront was a forest of smokestacks and masts. Hundreds of steamboats were jammed nose to tail, their whistles screaming in a discordant symphony. The levee was a sea of mud and movement. Thousands of barrels, crates, and wagons were being loaded and unloaded. Mules brayed, men shouted in dozens of languages: French, German, English, Spanish. It was a city bursting at the seams, swelling with the influx of thousands of dreamers just like him. "Smell that?" Silas asked, leaning on the rail beside him. Elias sniffed the air. It smelled of coal, manure, rotting fish, and wet wood. "Smell what?" "The West," Silas grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Smells like opportunity and horse shit. Mostly horse shit." They disembarked into the chaos. Elias had to fight to keep his footing in the mud. Touts grabbed at his sleeves, offering rooms, horses, maps, and company. He kept his hand firmly on his wallet and his eyes on Silas's back. They found a cheap boarding house near the waterfront, a place where the walls were thin and the beds were infested with bugs. But Elias didn't care. He was exhausted. That night he sat in the common room nursing a mug of lukewarm ale. The room was packed with men studying maps by candlelight. "The Independence route is the only way," one man argued, slamming his fist on a table. "The Santa Fe Trail will get you killed by Comanches." "And the northern route will freeze you to death," another countered. "You have to leave by May 1st, not a day later." Elias listened, absorbing the information. He knew he had to get to Independence, Missouri, the true jumping-off point for the Oregon and California trails. That's where the wagon trains formed. That's where he would buy the supplies that would determine whether he lived or died. He pulled Julian's letter out of his pocket. The paper was getting soft from handling. Come to California. He was closer now, but the distance remaining was terrifying. Between here and the gold lay 2,000 miles of wilderness. He looked at his hands. Here is Chapter 3, Gathering at Independence. This chapter immerses Elias in the chaotic, muddy, and desperate atmosphere of the frontier's edge, focusing on the critical logistics of survival and the formation of the community that will travel into the unknown. Chapter 3, Gathering at Independence. Independence, Missouri, in the spring of 1849, was not a town. It was a concussion of humanity. It was the bottleneck of the nation, the precise point where the civilized world frayed, snapped, and dissolved into the wild. If St. Louis had been chaotic, Independence was bedlam. The streets were churned into a knee-deep quagmire of black mud, a sticky soup composed of rain, soil, and the manure of 10,000 animals. The air vibrated with a cacophony that never ceased: the sharp crack of bullwhips, the mournful lowing of oxen, the ringing of blacksmith hammers, and the shouting of men desperate to buy, sell, or swindle. Elias Thorne stood on the corner of the town square, his boots sinking into the muck. He watched a man in a silk top hat arguing with a mule trader who looked like he hadn't bathed since the war at 1812. $50 for that sway-backed glue factory? The man in the hat screamed. "That's robbery." "That's supply and demand, friend," the trader spat, not looking up from whittling a stick. "You want a mule, that's the price. You want to walk to California? That's free." Elias felt a hand clamp onto his shoulder. It was Silas Vane. "Close your mouth, Boston," Silas muttered, steering him away from the argument. "You catch flies or you look like a mark. Neither is good for your health." "It's overwhelming," Elias admitted, adjusting the weight of his kit bag. "It's the funnel," Silas said. 50,000 people trying to fit through a door the size of a wagon trail, and the clock is ticking. We have to be on the grass before the 1st of May, but not before the grass is high enough to feed the stock. Timing is everything. Leave too early, the animals starve. Leave too late, the snows in the Sierras bury you alive. They made their way toward the outfitters, massive canvas tents and hastily erected wooden structures that lined the muddy streets. This was where the dreamers were converted into travelers, or where they were fleeced of every penny they had. The mathematics of survival. The interior of Hiram's general store and outfitter smelled of raw leather, coffee beans, and desperation. The walls were lined with barrels of flour, sacks of sugar, and crates of bacon. Elias pulled out the list Silas had dictated to him the night before. It was a terrifying document. It wasn't a shopping list. It was an equation for staying alive for 5 months. Flour, 600 pounds. Bacon, 400 pounds. Coffee, 60 pounds. Sugar, 100 pounds. Dried fruit, 50 pounds. Salt, pepper, and saleratus, baking soda. Rifle, powder, lead. "We need a wagon," Elias said to the clerk, a hurried young man with ink stains on his cuffs that reminded Elias painfully of his former life. "We have Conestogas out back," the clerk said fast. "Heavy duty, haul 3 tons. "No," Silas cut in sharp. "We don't want a Conestoga. Too heavy. They sink in the sand and die on the hills. We want a prairie schooner, light build, hickory bows, and we want the bed caulked so it can float." The clerk eyed Silas, recognizing a veteran. His demeanor shifted from predatory to respectful. "I have 2 left, out back." They walked out to the yard. The prairie schooner was smaller than the massive freight wagons of the East. It looked fragile, almost boat-like, with its angled bed and white canvas bonnet. "She's small," Elias noted. "She's survivable," Silas corrected. "Now the engine." He pointed to the corrals. There were horses, mules, and oxen. "Horses are for riding," Silas lectured as they walked through the muck. "They can't pull heavy loads on prairie grass. They need grain, and you can't carry enough grain." "So mules?" Elias asked. "They say they're faster." "Mules are faster," Silas nodded, "but they're stubborn. They stampede if a leaf blows the wrong way, and the Indians love to steal 'em. Plus, they cost $100 a head." Silas stopped in front of a pen full of large, docile beasts with wide horns and wet noses. "We take oxen. They're slow, dumb as rocks, but they pull steady, they don't stampede, and Indians generally don't want 'em. And most importantly," Silas tapped his stomach, "if we get stuck in the mountains and run out of food, you can't eat a wagon wheel, but you can eat an ox." Elias looked at the soulful brown eyes of the nearest ox. "That's a grim calculation." "The trail is a grim place, Boston." They bought 6 oxen, 4 to pull, 2 for relief. They bought the wagon, they bought the flour, the bacon, the coffee. Elias watched his stack of notebanks dwindle terrifyingly fast. When the final tally was paid, he had less than $50 left. He was fully committed. He owned 2,000 pounds of supplies and a wagon. He was technically homeless, yet he carried his home on wheels. The company of strangers. A single wagon on the Oregon Trail was a suicide note. To survive, one needed a train, a company of wagons, organized under a captain, governed by a set of bylaws. Silas and Elias spent 2 days wandering the encampments that ringed the town. The fields were a sea of white canvas, thousands of fires flickering in the twilight. They interviewed with several groups. Some were strictly religious, forbidding travel on Sundays. Others were chaotic gatherings of drinkers and gamblers. Finally, they found the Liberty Company. They were camped on a ridge overlooking the river. There were 30 wagons arranged in a loose circle. The equipment looked well maintained, the animals healthy. The captain was a man named Ezra Blackwood. He was a giant of a man, with a beard like iron wire and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, disappearing into the whiskers. He sat on a crate by a fire, cleaning a massive Hauken rifle. "Silas Vane," Silas introduced. "Trapper, guide." Blackwood looked up. His eyes were the color of flint. "I know the name. You were with Fremont in 45? "Briefly," Silas said. "Didn't care for the military discipline." "We have discipline here," Blackwood said, his voice a low rumble. "We have bylaws. Every man takes a guard shift. Every man pulls his weight. No liquor on the trail. No gambling when the sun is up. And the captain's word is law. You got a problem with that?" "No problem," Silas said. "I'm looking to get to the gold fields, same as you." Blackwood turned his gaze to Elias.
It felt like being scanned by a predator. "And who's this? He looks like he's never held anything heavier than a quill pen." Elias straightened his spine. "Elias Thorne. I'm adaptable." "Adaptable," Blackwood scoffed. "Can you shoot?" "I bought a rifle." "I didn't ask if you own one. I asked if you can shoot it." Blackwood picked up a tin cup and tossed it into the air. "Hit it." Elias fumbled for the new rifle he had purchased that morning. It was heavy, unfamiliar. By the time he raised it, the cup had already hit the ground. The man around the fire chuckled. "He's green, Ezra," Silas cut in smoothly, "but he listens and he's got capital. He paid for our rig. I'll vouch for him. I'll teach him to shoot. You need men who can stand watch, and I can stand 2 shifts for his one until he's ready." Blackwood studied them for a long moment. He spit into the fire. "We leave at dawn on Thursday. $5 buy-in for the company fund. If you fall behind, we don't wait. If you break a wheel, you fix it or you leave it. If you get sick, well, try not to get sick." "Are we in?" Elias asked. "You're in," Blackwood grunted. "Don't make me regret it." The last night. The night before departure, the atmosphere in the camp changed. The frantic energy of preparation evaporated, replaced by a somber, heavy silence. Elias sat by their small fire, watching the flames dance. Around them, other families were doing the same. I saw a man playing a soft, mournful tune on a fiddle, the girl I left behind me. I saw a woman weeping quietly into her husband's shoulder. They met their neighbors that evening. To their left was the Callahan family. Patrick, a red-faced Irishman with a laugh like a cannon blast, his wife Maureen, and their 3 children. They were fleeing the famine, seeking a farm in Oregon. "Gold?" Patrick laughed when Elias told him his destination. "No, lad, you can't eat gold. I want dirt, good black dirt that grows potatoes the size of your head. That's the real treasure." To their right were 2 brothers from Kentucky, Isaac and Jed. They were young, brash, and heavily armed, treating the trip like a grand hunting expedition. Elias pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. He used the back of a crate as a desk. "Dear Mr. Hemlock." He stared at the words. What was there to say? He crossed it out. "Dear Father." He paused. His father was dead. He wrote simply, "To the man I used to be. You would not recognize me here. My hands are blistered. My boots are caked in mud. I own an ox named Brutus. I am terrified, truly, deeply terrified. But for the first time in my life, I am not bored. I am going..."
Here is Chapter 4, The Endless Sea of Grass. This chapter focuses on the psychological and physical toll of the Great Plains, the crushing monotony of the trail, and the first taste of the true wilderness. Chapter 4, The Endless Sea of Grass. The world had become horizontal. For Elias Thorne, who had spent his life navigating the vertical canyons of Boston's brick streets and the towering shelves of the counting house, the Great Plains were a shock to the nervous system. There were no walls here. There were no ceilings. There was only the sky, a crushing dome of blue that stretched from one edge of the universe to the other, and the grass, an infinite green ocean that rippled under the wind like water. They had been on the trail for 3 weeks. Independence was a memory. The trees had thinned out, becoming miserly clusters of cottonwoods clinging to the creek beds, until finally they vanished altogether. Now there was only the horizon. It was a perfect, terrifying circle. No matter how far they walked, the circle never moved. It felt like walking on a treadmill designed by God to test the sanity of insects. "Gee! Haw! Get up, you stubborn piles of beef!" Elias's voice was raw. His throat was coated in a permanent layer of dust that tasted of limestone and grit. He walked on the left side of the oxen, swinging the hickory goad stick, trying to keep Brutus and his partner Nero in line. The romance of the Argonaut had died somewhere around mile 50. In its place was the grind. The grind was a beast that woke them at 4 a.m. It was the bugle call shattering the cold pre-dawn air. It was the hasty breakfast of hardtack, biscuits so hard they had to be soaked in coffee to avoid breaking teeth, and fried bacon. It was the yoking of the oxen, a dangerous dance of horns and hooves in the dark. And then the walking. 12 miles a day, 15 if the ground was flat and the mud wasn't too deep. 2 miles an hour. It was a pace that eroded the soul. A man could walk faster than the wagons, but he couldn't leave them, so he trudged. He watched the white canvas of the wagon ahead of him sway back and forth, a hypnotizing metronome counting down the seconds of his life. "Stop looking at the horizon," Silas warned him one afternoon as they plodded through the tall blue-stem grass. "It doesn't move," Elias muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. The sun was a physical weight on his shoulders. "We've been walking since sunrise, and that cloud hasn't moved an inch." "Looking at the horizon gives a man the prairie madness," Silas said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice at a grasshopper. "The mind can't handle the nothingness. It starts inventing things, cities in the clouds, lakes that aren't there, voices." "I hear voices already," Elias said. "Mostly yours telling me I'm doing it wrong." Silas chuckled. "That's not madness, Boston. That's education. The fuel of the frontier." The lack of trees presented a logistical nightmare that Elias had never considered in his frantic reading of guidebooks. There was no wood for fires. "No wood means no coffee," Silas had stated grimly on their second day in the open plains, "and no coffee means mutiny." The solution lay scattered in the grass, dried and gray, looking like flat stones. "Buffalo chips," Silas announced, kicking a disc of dried bison manure with his boot. "Nature's charcoal." Elias stared at it in horror. "You want us to cook our food over excrement? It burns hot, it burns slow, and it don't smell like shit once it's dry. Start collectin'." And so, Elias Thorne, formerly a gentleman of Beacon Hill, became a scavenger of dung. Every evening, after the wagons circled up, he would take a sack and wander the perimeter, hunting for the chips. He wasn't alone. The children of the Callahan family made it a game, racing to see who could find the biggest pile. "Look at this one, Mr. Thorne," little Sean Callahan yelled, holding up a chip the size of a dinner plate. "It's a beauty." "Magnificent, Sean," Elias said, tossing it into his sack. He looked at his hands. They were brown, calloused, and covered in dust. He wondered what Mr. Hemlock would say if he could see his former clerk now fighting a 6-year-old child for a piece of dried dung. Strangely, Elias found he didn't care. The disgust had faded, replaced by utility. Fire meant warmth. Fire meant hot food. And out here, those were the only currencies that mattered. The river god. The monotony of the grass was broken only by the terror of the rivers. The Kansas River was the first true test. It was swollen with spring rains, a churning brown snake of water that looked angry and hungry. There were no bridges. There was only a rickety ferry operated by a couple of entrepreneurial Shawnee Indians who charged $1 a wagon, or the option to caulk the wagons and float them across. Captain Blackwood rode up and down the line on his massive bay horse, his voice booming over the roar of the water. "Float! Caulk 'em tight! If your wagon takes water, your flour is paste and you starve. Double-team the oxen on the bank. I want ropes on the upstream side." The process was chaos. The wagons had to be lowered down the muddy, steep banks. The oxen, smelling the water and the danger, balked. When it was Elias's turn, his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Easy, Brutus. Easy, boys," he soothed, his hand on the yoke. "Keep 'em movin'," Silas shouted from the other side of the team, wielding a long whip. "If they stop in the mud, we're sunk."
The wagon slid down the bank with a sickening lurch. The wheels hit the water with a splash. For a terrifying moment, the wagon didn't float. It just sat there, the water rising toward the floorboards where the sugar was stored. "Push!" Silas screamed. Elias waded into the freezing water. It came up to his waist, heavy and powerful. He put his shoulder against the tailgate and shoved. He slipped in the mud, went under, swallowed a mouthful of grit, and came up sputtering. "Heave!" The wagon groaned. The buoyancy took hold. It bobbed up, drifting like a clumsy boat. The oxen were swimming now, their heads held high, eyes wide with panic. They guided it across, fighting the current that tried to drag them downstream toward the Mississippi. When the wheels finally found traction on the far bank, the oxen scrambled up, dragging the dripping wagon onto the grass. Elias collapsed on the bank, gasping for air, soaking wet. He looked up at the sky. He felt alive, electrified. Silas walked over and offered him a hand. "Not bad, Boston. You didn't drown." "I swallowed half the river," he coughed. "Good for the digestion. Cleans you out." The night watch. The days were for labor, but the nights were for fear. The Liberty Company formed a tight circle every evening, tongue to tail, creating a fortress of wood and canvas. Inside the circle, the oxen were corralled. Outside, the darkness was absolute. Elias's name appeared on the guard roster for the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. shift. He stood outside the circle, his rifle cradled in his arms. The wind had died down. The silence was heavy, a physical pressure against his ears. This was when the vastness truly hit him. He looked up. The stars were not like the stars in Boston. There were too many of them. They were a dusting of diamond dust across the black velvet of space, so bright they hurt his eyes. The Milky Way was a slashed scar of light. He felt insignificantly small, a speck of dust on a rock hurtling through a void. If he died here, the grass would grow over his bones in a season. The wind would blow. The stars would shine. The world would not notice. Snap! Elias spun around, raising his rifle. His heart leapt into his throat. "Easy, son," a voice whispered. It was Ezra Blackwood. The captain moved like a ghost, silent despite his size. "Captain," Elias breathed, lowering the weapon. "I didn't hear you approach." "That's the point," Blackwood said. He stood beside Elias, looking out into the dark. "You're staring at the fire, ruins your night vision. You look out, not in, and you listen." "It's quiet," Elias said. "It's never quiet," Blackwood corrected. "Listen." Elias closed his eyes. Slowly, the layers of silence peeled away. He heard the rustle of the grass, the distant yip-yapping of a coyote pack, the hoot of an owl, and something else, a low, rhythmic thrumming like the earth itself was breathing. "Buffalo," Blackwood said softly. "A herd, maybe 5 miles north, thousands of them. Will they come this way? Maybe. If they do, they'll flatten us like kindling, or they might provide us with meat for a month." Blackwood lit a pipe, the match flaring briefly, illuminating his scarred face. "How are you holding up, Torn?" "I'm tired, Captain. Every muscle hurts." "Good. Pain means you're building muscle. It's the indifference you have to worry about." "Indifference?" "The prairie eats the weak," Blackwood said, devoid of malice, stating it like a fact of geology. "But it also eats the impatient. I've seen—"
Here is Chapter 5, Storms over the Platte River. This chapter tests the resolve of the Liberty Company against the violent, unpredictable forces of nature on the open plains, marking the transition from mere travel to a battle for survival. Chapter 5, Storms over the Platte River. The Platte River was a paradox. It was a mile wide and an inch deep, a ribbon of dirty water that wound its way through a landscape so flat it felt like the bottom of a dried-up ocean. It was, as Silas Vane put it, too thick to drink, too thin to plow. For 10 days they had followed its southern bank. The scenery had devolved from the rolling green waves of the prairie into a gritty, monotone beige. The heat was no longer a warmth, it was a hammer. It radiated off the sandy soil, baking the wagon wheels until the wood shrank and the iron tires rattled loose. Elias Thorne walked with a handkerchief tied over his nose and mouth. The dust kicked up by 300 oxen created a permanent choking fog that coated his eyelashes, filled his ears, and turned his sweat into mud rivulets running down his neck. "Water!" a voice croaked from the wagon ahead. It was Maureen Callahan. Her youngest, baby Rose, was crying, a thin, reedy sound that cut through the grinding of the wheels. "Keep moving, Mrs. Callahan," Salas said, walking up alongside. "River water's poison right now. Too much alkali. We'll hit a spring in 5 miles. 5 miles might as well be the moon," Patrick Callahan muttered, his face red and peeling. He slapped the rump of his lead ox with unnecessary force. "Get up, you useless beast!" Tempers were fraying. The novelty of the adventure had evaporated, leaving behind only the raw friction of 60 people trapped in a slow-moving prison. Arguments broke out over trivialities, whose turn it was to gather chips, whose dog was barking too loud, who was lagging behind. Elias kept his head down. He focused on Brutus's hooves. Left, right, left, right. The anvil in the sky. It happened in the late afternoon. The heat, which had been oppressive all day, suddenly spiked. The air became heavy, static, making the hair on Elias's arms stand up. The birds, usually noisy in the river brush, went silent. Even the oxen seemed to sense it, lifting their heads and sniffing the air nervously. "West," a voice croaked. Elias looked. The horizon, usually a pale blue haze, had disappeared. In its place was a wall of darkness. It wasn't gray, it was a bruised, sickly purple, tinged with a terrifying shade of green at the edges. Clouds piled on top of one another, building a towering cathedral of vapor that reached impossibly high into the atmosphere. "Anvil cloud," Captain Blackwood shouted, dangling down the line. "Storm! Corral! Corral now! Tight circle! Chain the wheels!" The order shattered the lethargy of the afternoon. The wagons, usually slow and ponderous, were whipped into a frenzy. "Gee! Haw! Hard over!" Elias grabbed Brutus's nose ring, dragging the massive head to the right. "Move! Move!" They formed the circle just as the temperature plummeted 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. The wind hit them like a physical blow, ripping the hat from Elias's head and sending it tumbling into the brush. He didn't chase it. "Covers!" Salas roared. "Lash down the covers!" They scrambled over the wagon, tying down the canvas flaps. The sky above them began to boil. Lightning didn't flash, it exploded. Jagged veins of fire tearing the sky apart, followed instantly by thunder that shook the ground so hard Elias felt it in his teeth. Then the bombardment began. It wasn't rain, it was ice. Hailstones the size of walnuts slammed into the ground, bouncing and shattering. Then they grew, golf balls, then eggs. "Under!" Salas shoved Elias beneath the wagon bed. They huddled in the mud, covering their heads with their arms. The noise was deafening, a roar like 1,000 locomotives. The canvas above them drummed violently. Elias heard a sickening crack, a wagon bow snapping under the assault. Outside, the animals were screaming. The oxen, terrified by the stinging ice, were pulling at their chains, their hooves churning the mud into a slurry. "The herd!" Blackwood's voice was barely audible over the wind. "They're breaking!" "They'll run till they die!" Salas yelled. He grabbed a coil of rope. "We have to hold the teams!" "Are you crazy?" Elias shouted back. "We'll be killed!" "If we lose the oxen, we walk to California. Get up!" Salas crawled out into the storm. Elias hesitated. He looked at the white hail bouncing in the mud. He looked at Salas's retreating back. "I need my blood." Elias cursed and crawled out. The hail hit him like stones thrown by a mob. One struck his shoulder, sending a shock wave of pain down his arm. Another grazed his ear. He scrambled toward Brutus. The ox was thrashing, his eyes rolling white. He had tangled his legs in the traces and was close to tipping the wagon. "Whoa! Whoa, boy!" Elias screamed, grabbing the yoke. He threw his weight against the animal's neck, hugging the wet, shivering beast. "I've got you! I've got you!" For 10 minutes, or perhaps an hour, the world was nothing but ice, wind, and terror. Elias held on. He became an anchor, a piece of granite refusing to move. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the fury ceased. The wind died. The hail turned to a cold, miserable rain, and then stopped. The aftermath. The silence that followed was broken only by the sobs of children and the groans of injured men. The camp was a wreck. 3 wagon covers were shredded, the precious flour inside turning to paste. The ground was covered in a layer of white ice, looking like a surreal winter landscape in the middle of summer. Elias let go of Brutus. His hands were locked in a claw-like grip, cramping painfully. He slid down into the mud, leaning his back against the wheel. He was bruised, soaked, and shivering uncontrollably. "Are you all right, Boston?" Salas appeared, wiping a blood from a cut on his forehead. I held him," Elias stammered, his teeth chattering. "You did," Salas nodded. He looked at the team. They were battered, but standing. "You saved the rig." Captain Blackwood walked the perimeter, assessing the damage. "Sound off! Casualties?" "Jed's arm is broke," came a shout from the Kentucky wagon. "We lost 2 cows. My cover is gone. Everything is soaked." Blackwood stopped in the center of the circle. He looked tired. "We patch up, we dry out, we find the stock, we move at dawn." "Move?" Patrick Callahan stepped forward, his face pale. "Captain, look at this. We're beaten. We need a day to rest." "You rest, you die," Blackwood said coldly. "The trail doesn't care about your comfort. The cholera is behind us, coming up the river. If we stop, it catches us. We move." He turned and walked away. That night, there were no fiddles. There was no laughter. The camp was a grim place of wet wood and sullen silence. Elias sat by a smoky fire, trying to dry his only shirt. He looked at the bruise blossoming on his shoulder. It was ugly, purple and yellow. He poked it. It hurt. "Badge of honor," Salas said, handing him a tin cup of coffee that tasted like mud. Elias took it. The warmth spread through his chest. "Silas," Elias said quietly. "Yeah?" "I didn't run." Salas looked at him over the rim of his cup. The firelight danced in his eyes. "No, you didn't." Elias looked out at the dark plain. The storm had passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean. In the distance, the lightning still flickered, a silent war on the horizon. He realized then that the clerk from Boston had died. He had died somewhere back on the Missouri River. The man sitting here, bruised and drinking mud, was something else. He was harder. He was part of the storm now. He took a sip of the coffee. It was the best thing he had ever tasted. "Tomorrow," Elias said. "Tomorrow," Salas agreed.
Here is Chapter 6, The Spine of the Continent. This chapter covers the grueling ascent into the Rocky Mountains, the heartbreaking necessity of abandoning possessions, and the psychological turning point of crossing the Continental Divide. Chapter 6, The Spine of the Continent. The horizon, which had been a flat line for weeks, finally broke. At first, Elias thought there were clouds. pale, jagged shapes hovering in the western sky, white against the blue. But as the days wore on, the clouds did not dissolve. They sharpened. They grew edges and shadows. They became stone and snow. The Rocky Mountains. "There she is," Silas said one morning, pointing with the stem of his pipe. "The backbone of the world." Elias stared. They looked impossible. After the endless crushing monotony of the plains, the mountains felt violent, a sudden vertical eruption that barred their way. They were beautiful, yes, majestic in a way that made the heart ache. But to a man dragging a wagon, they looked like a fortress wall. The terrain changed under their feet. The soft buffalo grass gave way to sagebrush that scraped against boots and wagon wheels. The dirt turned to grit, then to rock. The air grew thinner, sharper, tasting of pine resin and ancient dust. And the road began to climb. It wasn't a steep, dramatic ascent at first. It was a relentless, grinding upward slope that never ended. Gravity, once a negligible force on the flats, became an active enemy. It pulled at the back of the wagons, straining the chains, digging the yoke into the oxen's necks until their skin rubbed raw. The trail of abandoned dreams. As the grade increased, the reality of physics set in. Force equals mass times acceleration. The oxen were losing mass. The acceleration was zero. Something had to give. They reached a stretch of trail near the Sweetwater River that looked like the aftermath of a looted city. Scattered along the roadside for miles were the possessions of those who had gone before. It was a graveyard of domesticity. Elias walked past a pristine mahogany chest of drawers abandoned in the sagebrush. He saw cast-iron stoves, sacks of beans that had burst open, heavy mining tools, and even a grand piano, its keys warping in the sun, silent and surreal in the wilderness. "Look at that," Silas muttered, shaking his head. "People pack their fears. They pack for the life they had, not the life they're going to." Captain Blackwood called a halt at midday. He rode down the line, his face grim. "Lighten up," he bellowed. "If you don't need it to breathe or shoot, dump it. We're hitting the steep grades tomorrow. Every pound is a pound your oxen have to pull up a wall. If your team dies, you die. Choose." The camp became a flurry of heartbreaking decisions. Arias watched Maureen Callahan weeping over a box of porcelain teacups. They were her grandmother's, carried from Ireland, across the ocean and half a continent. "We can't leave them, Patrick," she sobbed. "The oxen are staggering, woman," Patrick shouted, his own voice cracking with strain. "Do you want the cups, or do you want to get the children to Oregon?" One by one, Maureen took the cups and smashed them against a rock. She couldn't bear to leave them whole for strangers to take. It was a violent, tragic sound. Tink, tink, smash. Elias went to his own wagon. He had already sold most of his things, but he looked again. The spare barrel of salt pork? Heavy. The extra chain? Heavy. He found the box of books he had hidden under the flour sacks, a few volumes of history and poetry that he had saved from the purge in Boston. He picked them up. The Iliad, the Odyssey. He thumbed the pages. "Sing, O muse, of the rage of Achilles." "Paper is heavy, Boston," Silas said softly from behind him. Elias sighed. He walked to the side of the trail and placed the books on a flat rock. He didn't smash them. Maybe some other dreamer, coming behind them, would find comfort in Homer. "Goodbye, old friends," he whispered. He returned to the wagon feeling lighter and yet hollowed out. They were being stripped down, layer by layer, until only the essential machinery of survival remained. The ascent. The next 3 days were a blur of agony. The trail wound through rocky canyons and up ridges that seemed impossibly steep.
The air was so dry it cracked their lips until they bled. The sun burned with a different intensity here, unfiltered by the thick atmosphere of the lowlands. Push! Heave! Elias's shoulder was raw. On the steepest grades, the oxen couldn't do it alone. The men had to physically shove the wagons from behind, digging their boots into the scree, gasping for oxygen in the thin air. "Come on, Brutus! Dig! Dig!" The ox groaned, his tongue lolling out, foam dripping from his mouth. His ribs were showing through his hide now. He wasn't the sleek beast that had left Independence. He was a machine running on reserve power. At a place called Devil's Gate, a narrow cleft in the rock where the Sweetwater River roared through, disaster struck the wagon ahead of them. It was the Kentucky brothers, Isaac and Jed. They were pushing hard to crest a ridge. A harness strap, worn thin for weeks of sweat and friction, snapped with a sound like a pistol shot. The left ox stumbled. The wagon lurched backward. "Block the wheel!" Silas screamed. But it was too late. The heavy wagon rolled back, gathered speed, and jackknifed. It tipped slowly, agonizingly over the edge of the trail, spilling crates and barrels down the rocky slope. It crashed onto its side 20 feet below, the wood splintering with a sickening crunch. The column stopped. Silence rushed back in. They scrambled down. Isaac was sitting in the wreckage, holding his head. He was bleeding, but alive. The wagon was destroyed. Their axle was snapped in two. Captain Blackwood stood over the ruin. He looked at the brothers, then at the sun. "Salvage what you can carry," Blackwood said. "Distribute your food among the other wagons, but the rig is done." "We can fix it," Jed pleaded. "Give us a day." "We don't have a day," Blackwood said. "We're behind schedule. You ride on the tailgate of the Callahan wagon. Your journey as captains is over. Now you're passengers." It was a brutal sentence. To lose one's wagon was to lose one's independence. But the mountains did not negotiate. South Pass. They expected a peak. They expected a sharp, dramatic summit where they could stand on a jagged spire and look down at the world. But South Pass, the legendary gateway to the west, was a deception. It was a wide, gentle saddle, a valley so broad and flat that Arias scarcely realized they were climbing the final stretch. The ground was covered in sagebrush and short grass. The peaks of the Wind River Range rose high to the north, snowy and jagged, but the pass itself was open, windy, and anticlimactic. "This is it?" Elias asked, panting as he walked beside Brutus. "This is the top of the continent?" "Don't let the look of it fool you," Silas said. "Look at the water." They stopped at a small marshy spring bubbling up from the ground. "Pacific Springs," Silas announced. Elias looked at the water. It trickled slowly, winding its way through the moss. "Back there," Silas pointed, "east, every drop of rain flows to the Mississippi, the Missouri, the Gulf, and the Atlantic. It flows home." He pointed to the trickle at their feet. "But this flows to the Colorado, to the Gulf of California, to the Pacific." Elias knelt down. He dipped his hand into the freezing water. He had crossed the line. He was no longer in the Atlantic world. He was in the Pacific world. The geometry of the earth had shifted. He was closer to China now than he was to Boston. The realization hit him with a physical force. He stood up and looked west. The view was not green. It was vast, brown, and hazy, a rugged, dry landscape stretching into infinity. The Great Basin, the desert. "It looks hard," Elias said. "The hard part is just starting," Silas said, lighting his pipe. "The plains were a test of patience. The mountains were a test of strength. What's coming next, that's a test of spirit." Captain Blackwood rode to the front of the column. He took off his hat and waved it toward the setting sun. "3 cheers for the Pacific slope," he roared. "Hurrah!
Hurrah! Hurrah! The men shouted, their voices thin in the vast open space. It was a cheer of relief, but also of defiance. They had beaten the ascent. They stood on the roof of America. Elias patted Brutus on the neck. "We're halfway, boy. We're halfway." But as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long purple shadows,
Here is Chapter 7, Thirst in the Great Basin. This chapter chronicles the most notorious and deadly stretch of the California Trail, the Humboldt Sink and the 40-mile desert, where the heat and lack of water brought the Liberty Company to the very edge of destruction. Chapter 7, Thirst in the Great Basin. The Great Basin was not a landscape. It was a furnace designed by a vengeful god. They had left the cool, thin air of the Rockies behind, descending into a bowl of dry earth that trapped the sun's heat and reflected it back with magnifying intensity. The greenery of the mountains had been replaced by the gray-green of sagebrush and the blinding white of alkali flats. For 3 weeks they had followed the Humboldt River. In any other part of the world, the Humboldt would barely qualify as a creek. It was a sluggish, twisting snake of water that grew narrower, warmer, and saltier the further west it flowed. It didn't flow to the ocean. It simply gave up and died, sinking into the parched earth at a place ominously called the Humboldt Sink. "Meanest river on God's earth," Silas Vane rasped. His lips were cracked, coated in a layer of white dust that made him look like a corpse. Wood too green to burn, water too alkali to drink, and banks too steep to climb. Elias Thorne walked beside the wagon. He didn't speak. Speaking required moisture, and moisture was a currency he couldn't afford to spend. His tongue felt swollen, a dry sponge filling his mouth. The dust was the enemy. It wasn't soil. It was a fine, caustic powder. It burned the eyes, chafed the skin raw under their clothes, and coated the lungs. Every breath was a struggle. The oxen were suffering the most. Their ribs heaved like bellows. Their eyes were dull, rimmed with the same white dust. They marched with heads low, their hooves kicking up clouds of the alkali poison that irritated their nostrils. "We're losing 'em," Captain Blackwood said one evening, looking at the herd. They had lost 4 oxen in 2 days, animals that simply lay down and refused to rise, their hearts bursting from the strain. "We're coming up on the Sink," Silas said, looking at the shimmering horizon. "And after that, the 40-mile. The 40-mile desert." It was the whisper that had haunted the camp since independence, a stretch of absolute nothingness between the end of the Humboldt and the safety of the Truckee River. No grass, no water, just sand and death. The edge of the void. They reached the Humboldt Sink on a Tuesday. The river widened into a marshy, stagnant pool surrounded by miles of white salt crust. The water was thick with mud and stank of sulfur. "Fill the barrels," Blackwood ordered. "Cut grass, cut anything green you can find. We rest until sundown. We cross at night." Elias worked in a daze. He waded into the marsh, cutting bundles of coarse wiregrass with a sickle. He filled the water kegs with the brownish sludge. It was vile, but it was wet. "Boil it," Silas advised. "Then add coffee. It hides the taste of the sulfur. Mostly." As the sun began to set, turning the salt flats into a sheet of blood-red fire, the mood in the camp was funeral. They were about to step into the void. "Listen to me," Blackwood gathered the company. He looked haggard, his beard matted with dust. "From this point on, there is no stopping. If you stop, you die. If an animal goes down, you cut it loose and keep moving. We have 24 hours to cross the sand. If the sun catches us out there tomorrow afternoon without water, we don't make it." He looked at the weary faces, the Callahan children, their eyes huge and frightened. The men stripped to their waists, their skin burnt the color of old leather. "Check your wheels, grease the axles, pray if you're inclined. We move at twilight." The March of the Dead. They entered the desert under the light of a half moon. The temperature dropped, but the ground still radiated the day's heat through the soles of Elias's boots. The silence was absolute. The soft sand muffled the sound of the wheels and hooves. It felt like they were a ghost train moving through purgatory. For the first 10 miles, the adrenaline kept them going. But as the hours dragged on, the fatigue set in. The sand was deep, soft, shifting dunes that sucked at the wheels. "Pull, Brutus, pull," Elias whispered. The trail was marked not by signs, but by carnage. This was the boneyard of the migration. In the moonlight, Elias saw the skeletons of oxen and horses that had perished in years past. They shone white against the dark sand. But worse were the fresh carcasses, animals from trains a few days ahead of them, bloated, stiff, bursting in the heat. The stench of rotting meat hung heavy in the air. And the wagons. They passed abandoned wagons every few hundred yards, perfectly good vehicles left behind because the teams had died. Elias saw a family trunk burst open, spilling lace dresses and children's toys onto the sand. He saw a mahogany grandfather clock standing upright in a dune, its hands frozen at 4:12. It was a surreal museum of failure. Around 2 a.m., the hallucination started. Elias was walking, staring at the back of the wagon, when he saw a fountain. It was crystal clear, bubbling up from the sand just to his left. He could hear the water splashing. He could smell the wet moss. He stumbled toward it. "Boston!" Silas's voice was a whip crack. A hand grabbed his collar and yanked him back. "Water!" Elias croaked, pointing. "Right there!" "There's nothing there," Silas said, shaking him. "It's the moon on the salt. Keep walking." Elias blinked. The fountain dissolved into a pile of bleached bones. He shuddered. "I saw it." "We all see it. Don't look at the sand. Look at the stars. Keep your feet moving." The sun rises. Dawn did not bring hope. It brought terror. As the sun crested the horizon, the temperature rocketed upward. By 8 a.m., it was 90 degrees. By 10 a.m., it was 100. We're halfway across. The oxen were failing. Their tongues hung out, swollen and black. They bellowed, a dry, rasping sound of agony. "Water the teams," Blackwood ordered. They stopped briefly to pour the foul Humboldt water into buckets. Elias offered the bucket to Brutus. The ox sniffed it, recoiled from the smell. Then desperation took over, and he drank greedily. "Save some for yourself," Silas warned. Elias took a sip from his canteen. The water was hot, slimy, and tasted of rot. He gagged but forced it down. They pushed on. The heat became a physical weight, pressing down on their skulls. The air shimmered. The distant mountains, the Sierra Nevada, looked like they were floating on a lake of blue water, a mirage. "Just a few more miles," Elias lied to the ox. "Just a few more." At mile 30, tragedy struck the Callahan wagon. Their lead ox, a massive beast named Red, simply stopped. He trembled, his legs buckled, and he collapsed into the sand with a heavy thud. Patrick beat the animal with his whip, screaming, crying, Get up, damn you!" The ox didn't move. Its eyes were glazed.
"Cut him loose," Blackwood roared, his horse staggering. "Leave him." "I can't," Patrick sobbed. "He's our strongest." "He's dead, Patrick," Blackwood roared. "Cut him loose or you kill the rest." They cut the traces. The wagon moved on, leaving the dying animal behind. As Elias passed, he saw the ox take one last shuddering breath. The scavengers, coyotes and vultures, were already watching from the dunes, waiting for their meal. The sacrifice. Mile 35. The sun was at its zenith. The heat was hallucinational. Elias felt like his skin was paper, ready to ignite. Brutus stumbled. The wagon jerked. Elias grabbed the yoke to steady him. The ox's breathing was a jagged rattle of agony. Elias looked at his canteen. He had perhaps a pint of water left. It was his life. If the wagon broke down, he would need it to walk out. He looked at Brutus. The animal's eye rolled to look at him. There was no fear there, only a boundless, crushing exhaustion. "I need my blood," Julian's words echoed. But Julian wasn't here. This beast was here.
Here is Chapter 8, Shadows of the Sierra Nevada. This chapter details the final, grueling ascent over the granite wall of the Sierras, the haunting legacy of the Donner Party, and the sheer mechanical impossibility of dragging wagons into the clouds. Chapter 8, Shadows of the Sierra Nevada. The Sierra Nevada did not welcome travelers. It barely tolerated them. If the Great Plains were an ocean and the desert a furnace, the Sierras were a fortress. Rising abruptly from the basin floor, the granite peaks shot upward like the teeth of a dragon, jagged, gray, and crowned with the white threat of eternal winter. Elias stood at the base of the eastern slope, craning his neck back until it hurt. The pine trees, massive, ancient giants, clung to cliffs that seemed vertical. High above, disappearing into a veil of mist, was the pass. "It looks vertical," Elias said, his voice hushed. "It is," Silas replied, tightening the cinch on his saddle. "It's the elephant, Boston. We've seen the tail and the trunk. Now we're looking the beast in the eye." Seeing the elephant was the trail phrase for the ultimate ordeal, the point where the adventure stopped being an adventure and became a trauma. The Liberty Company was a shadow of the unit that had left Independence. The wagons were rickety, the wheels wrapped in rawhide to keep the iron tires from falling off. The oxen were skeletal, their hip bones protruding like coat hooks. The men were gaunt, bearded specters with hollow eyes. But they were hardened. They were no longer farmers and clerks. They were a machine made of muscle and grit. The ghosts of the timber. The ascent began not with a road, but with a scramble. The trail wove through massive boulders and dense timber. The air grew colder with every 100 feet of elevation, a sharp shock after the furnace of the desert. As they climbed, a new fear settled over the company. It wasn't the fear of thirst or heat. It was the fear of the calendar. It was late September. The sky was a brilliant, hard blue, but the wind carried a biting chill. Everyone knew the story. It had happened only 3 years ago, in 1846, the Donner Party, trapped by early snows just a few miles from where they now walked, reduced to starvation and madness in the white silence. "Keep moving," Captain Blackwood rode up and down the line, his voice tight. "Don't look at the sky, look at the trail. We have to beat the snow." They passed a clearing where the trees had been cut high off the ground, stumps standing 6 feet tall. "Why are the trees cut so high?" Elias asked, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. Silas didn't look at him. "Because that's how deep the snow was when they cut them for firewood. That's the Donner camp."
Elias felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the wind. He looked at the peaceful forest, the dappled sunlight on the pine needles. It was a graveyard. The ghosts were watching them, whispering from the shadows, "Hurry." The wall of stone. On the third day of the ascent, they reached the wall. It was a granite face, slick and steep, rising at a 45-degree angle for 300 yards. There was no way to drive a wagon up it. The oxen couldn't find purchase. "Uncouple," Blackwood roared. "Everything comes out. We haul them empty." This was the brutal mathematics of the Sierras. To move a wagon up the slope, it had to be unloaded. Every sack of flour, every barrel of beans, every tool had to be carried on the backs of men or mules. Then the empty wagon had to be hauled up by ropes. Then the contents reloaded. It was back-breaking labor. Elias strapped a 100-pound sack of flour to his back. He bent double, grasping the roots of shrubs to pull himself up the slick rock. His lungs burned in the thin air. His legs trembled. One step, just one step. He reached the top of the ledge, dropped the sack, and collapsed, gasping. He looked down. The men looked like ants swarming a hill. "Get up, Thorne," Silas yelled from below. "The wagon is next." They rigged a system of pulleys and ropes around a massive pine tree at the summit. Chains were attached to the wagon tongue. "Heave!" 10 men at the top pulled on the rope. Below, the oxen scrambled, their hooves striking sparks on the granite, trying to provide forward momentum. "Heave!" The wagon groaned. It inched up the rock face, creaking and swaying. Disaster nearly struck when the Callahan wagon was halfway up. A rope frayed, snapping a strand with a loud pop. The wagon shuddered, sliding a foot back. "Hold it!" Elias screamed, throwing his weight onto the safety line. The rough hemp burned his palms, tearing the skin. "Don't let it go!" Patrick Callahan and Silas jumped in, grabbing the spokes of the wheels, physically holding the wagon against gravity, while the men at the top retied the knot. "Pull!" They dragged it over the lip of the ledge. It slammed down onto flat ground, safe. Elias looked at his hands. They were bleeding. He wrapped them in rags. There was no time for pity. There were 20 more wagons to go. The summit. They reached the summit of the pass 2 days later. The final push was through a dusting of fresh snow, powder that crunched under their boots and terrified the captain. But the storm held off. The sky remained clear. When Elias crested the final ridge, the wind hit him with the force of a gale. It was freezing, pure and clean. He stood next to Brutus. The ox was shivering, his breath pluming in the air. Below them, to the west, the world fell away. It wasn't the brown, dusty view of the east. It was a tumbling cascade of green, valleys upon valleys of pine, fir, and oak, descending into a blue haze far in the distance. "California," Silas said, taking off his battered hat. "Is that it? The gold fields?" Elias asked. "That's the Sacramento Valley," Silas pointed. "The gold is in the rivers down there, the American, the Yuba, the Feather." Elias looked at the vast landscape. It looked wild. It looked rich. It looked like the end of the world and the beginning of a new one. He felt a sudden, overwhelming emotion welling up in his throat. He wanted to scream. He wanted to weep. He had walked across a continent. He had survived the cholera, the storms, the desert, and the wall. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the nugget. He held it up to the sun. The light caught the gold, flaring brightly against the deep green of the pines. "We're here, Julian," he whispered. "I'm here." Captain Blackwood rode up. He didn't cheer, he didn't smile, but his shoulders slumped, the tension of 5 months finally releasing. "It's all downhill from here, boys,"
Captain Blackwood shouted, his voice cracking. "Rough brakes, shoe the wheels. We sleep in the promised land tonight." The descent was in many ways more dangerous than the climb. The road was steep, winding through narrow canyons where a single slip meant tumbling 1,000 feet into a gorge. They had to rough lock the wheels, wrapping chains around the rims so they wouldn't turn, forcing the wagons to skid down the trail like sleds. They tied huge logs to the back of the wagons to act as drag anchors. The noise was deafening, the screech of iron on stone, the snapping of branches, the shouting of men. But the air changed. As they dropped in elevation, the biting cold of the summit faded. The air grew warmer, softer. The smell of pine became intense and sweet. Oak trees appeared, their leaves turning gold and russet in the autumn light. They camped in a meadow lush with deer grass. A clear stream bubbled through it, water that flowed west toward the ocean. Elias sat by the fire. He was too tired to eat. He just stared at the flames. "You made it, Boston," Silas said, carving a piece of venison. "You're an Argonaut now." Elias looked at his hands. They were scarred, stained, and hard as rock. He touched his face. A thick beard covered his jaw. "I don't feel like an Argonaut. I feel like a survivor." "Same thing," Silas grunted. "Now comes the hard part." "Hard part? We just crossed the Sierras." "That was just walking," Silas pointed toward the dark valley below. "Down there is the gold, and where there's gold, there's greed. The mountains don't care if you live or die, but down there, men do." Elias nodded. He understood. The battle against nature was over. The battle against human nature was about to begin. He lay back on the grass. Above him, the stars were framed by the tower.
Here is Chapter 9, The Golden Promise of Coloma. This chapter describes the descent into the chaos of the gold fields, the shock of the inflated economy, and the tense reunion between the brothers in a land driven by paranoia. Chapter 9, The Golden Promise of Coloma. The descent from the high Sierra was a journey through seasons. They left the eternal winter of the peaks, passed through the cool autumn of the pine forests, and finally emerged into the scorching, dry summer of the foothills. The landscape here was different. The earth was a violent, rusty red, contrasting sharply with the golden brown of the dried oak leaves. It was a rugged, dusty country of ravines and ridges, scorched by the sun and scarred by the frantic activity of men. Elias walked beside the wagon. Brutus, the faithful ox, was now little more than a walking skeleton, his ribs jutting out like the hull of a wrecked ship. But he moved with a lightness that suggested he knew the journey was ending. They heard Coloma before they saw it. It wasn't the sound of a city, no church bells, no factory whistles. It was a dull, rhythmic roar, the sound of thousands of picks striking stone, the sound of gravel rattling in metal pans, the sound of water rushing through wooden sluices, and above it all, the shouting of men in a dozen languages. "There," Silas said, pointing with his whip. Below them, in a valley cut by the South Fork of the American River, lay the epicenter of the world's madness. It wasn't a town. It was a festering wound on the landscape, a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, brush huts, log cabins, and blankets thrown over bushes. Smoke hung low over the river, mixing with the dust to create a permanent haze. "Sutter's Mill," Elias whispered, "the end of the rainbow." The economy of madness. They drove the wagon down the main street, if a muddy track between tents could be called a street. The assault on the senses was immediate. The smell was a potent cocktail of unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, wood smoke, and whiskey.
The crowd was a swirling tapestry of humanity. Elias saw tall men in serapes from Sonora, pigtailed men in blue tunics from China, Kanakas from the Sandwich Islands, and ragged veterans of the Oregon Trail like himself. They stopped in front of a large tent with a sign painted on a crate lid, "The Empire Store." "We need supplies, fresh meat, vegetables, whiskey," Silas said. Elias nodded. He still had the $50 he had saved from independence. He felt rich. He walked into the store. It was dark and smelled of molasses. A man with one eye and a shotgun on the counter watched him. "How much for the onions?" Elias asked, pointing to a small withered pile. "$1 apiece," the storekeep grunted. $1 for a sack?" Elias blinked. $1 for an onion, greenhorn. $10 for a sack of flour. $50 for a shovel. Take it or leave it." Elias stared. In Boston, $1 would buy a week's worth of groceries. Here, it bought a vegetable. "That's robbery," Elias said. "That's California," the man shrugged. "You got gold? If not, get out." Elias walked back out, stunned. "Silas, we're poor. My money is worthless here." Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. He pointed to our wagon. "We ain't poor, Boston. We're merchants. Look what we have." He patted the side of our wagon. Inside were the remnants of our supplies, extra bacon, coffee, and 50 pounds of sugar we hadn't used. "We sell the surplus. We sell the wagon. We sell the oxen. We'll be flush in an hour." And they were. They sold the battered wagon for firewood. They sold the oxen to a butcher for $300. They sold the extra bacon for $5 a pound. By sunset, Elias held a leather pouch heavy with gold dust and coins, more money than he had made in 2 years at Hemlock & Sons. But as he looked at Brutus being led away to the slaughter pen, he felt a sharp pang of guilt. "Don't look," Silas gently said. "He got you here. He did his job." The search. With money in his pocket and a belly full of fresh beef and horribly expensive whiskey, Elias began his search. He walked from fire to fire, showing the letter. "I'm looking for Julian Thorne, arrived last year from Boston." Most men just shook their heads. Names didn't mean much here. Men changed them like socks. "Julian Thorne?" a red-beard miner muttered, looking up from his pan. "Tall fella? Loud? Talks like a preacher?" "That's him," Elias said, his heart jumping. "Yeah, I recall him. He was working a bar on the river for a while. Then he got secretive, said he found the mother lode up a tributary, disappeared into the canyons about 2 months ago. Folks say he went bush." "Which canyon?" The man pointed north, towards a dark, jagged slash in the hills. "Dead Man's Gulch, rough country, rattlesnakes and claim jumpers. If he's up there, he don't want to be found." Elias looked at the canyon. "He sent for me." "And you better hope he recognizes you before he shoots you," the man laughed. The climb to Dead Man's Gulch. The next morning, Elias said goodbye to Silas Vane. The old trapper was heading south toward the Tuolumne River. "Too crowded here," Silas said, spitting. "I need elbow room. You watch your back, Boston. You're a good man. Don't let the gold eat your soul." "Thank you, Silas, for everything." They shook hands, a firm, calloused grip that bridged the gap between the clerk and the mountain man. Silas turned and walked away, disappearing into the dust. Elias was alone. He shouldered his pack, rifle, pickaxe, shovel, and pan, and blankets, and began the hike up Dead Man's Gulch. The trail was narrow, winding through Poison Oak and Manzanita. The river here was wilder, crashing over white boulders. The walls of the canyon grew steep, blocking out the sun. He walked for hours. He saw signs of digging, abandoned holes, broken rockers, but no people. It was eerie. Then he saw smoke. It was a thin wisp rising from a cluster of boulders near a bend in the creek. A small, ragged tent was pitched under a massive oak tree. Elias stopped. He checked his rifle, ensuring the cap was in place. He approached slowly. "Julian?" he called out. His voice echoed off the canyon walls. Silence. "Julian, it's Elias. I got your letter." A rustle in the bushes, the distinct click-clack of a revolver hammer being cocked. "Stop right there," a voice rasped. It was familiar, yet distorted, hoarse, cracked, and edged with a terrifying tension. Elias froze, raising his empty hands. "It's me, Julian. Look at me." A figure emerged from the shadows of the rocks. Elias gasped. The man who stepped out was a scarecrow. His clothes were rags, stiff with dirt and grease. His hair was a wild, matted mane that hung to his shoulders. His beard reached his chest. But it was the eyes that shocked Elias. They were sunken, fever-bright, darting back and forth like a trapped animal's. He held a Colt Navy revolver leveled at Elias's chest. "Eli," he whispered. "It's me," Elias said, his voice trembling. "I came. I brought the supplies. I'm here." Julian lowered the gun slowly. He stumbled forward, then stopped, swaying. You're real? You're not another ghost?" "I'm real," Elias said. He stepped forward and grabbed his brother's shoulders. Under the rags, Julian was thin, feverishly hot. Julian let out a sob and collapsed into Elias's shoulder. "You came, Eli," he wept into his shoulder. "They're watching me, Eli. They're in the trees. They want it. They all want it." "Who?" Elias asked. "The wolves," Julian hissed, pulling back to look around wildly. "But we'll stop them. You and me. We'll stop them." The honey hole. Julian dragged him toward the creek. He moved with a manic energy, ignoring his obvious exhaustion. "Look, Eli," he whispered. He pointed to a deep pool formed by a bend in the stream. The water was clear, but the bottom was dark with sediment. "I found it 3 months ago," Julian said, his voice trembling. "The ancient channel. The river cut through a quartz vein up there. It all washed down into this hole. It's trapped here, thousands of years of it." He waded into the freezing water, not bothering to roll up his trousers. He grabbed a shovel, dug into the gravel at the bottom, and dumped a load into a wooden pan. He shook it, swirled it. The gravel washed away, the sand washed away, and there it was. It wasn't dust. It was a thick, heavy crescent of yellow metal at the bottom of the pan. It looked like melted butter. "Gold," Elias breathed. 3 ounces in 1 pan, Julian giggled. 3 ounces, Eli. That's $50 in 5 minutes, and the bottom is paved with it. He grabbed Elias's arm, his grip painful. "But I can't sleep. I can't leave. If I leave to get food, they'll jump the claim. If I sleep, they'll slit my throat. I've been eating acorn."
Here is Chapter 10, A Town Built on Greed. This chapter explores the rapid, cancerous growth of the mining camps, the intoxicating and dangerous atmosphere of Hangtown, Placerville, and the terrifying realization that in a land without law, success is a death sentence. Chapter 10, A Town Built on Greed. Gold has a sound. It is not the chiming of coins, nor the clink of metal on stone. It is the sound of silence that falls over a room when a heavy pouch hits a counter. It is the sudden cessation of breath, the sharpening of eyes, the collective intake of envy. Elias Thorne learned this sound 2 weeks after arriving in Dead Man's Gulch. The claim, which Julian had christened the Sanctuary, was everything his brother had promised. It was a geological freak of nature, a natural trap in the bedrock where the river over millennia had deposited its heaviest treasures. They didn't need complex machinery. They needed strong backs and patience. The work was brutal. From dawn till dusk, they stood knee-deep in the freezing meltwater, shoveling gravel into the long tom, a wooden trough Julian had cobbled together. They washed the dirt, rocked the cradle, and watched the magic happen. Every evening, the black sand at the bottom of the riffles yielded a dull, heavy yellow paste.
They were pulling out 20 ounces a day. At $16 an ounce, they were making $320 a day. In Boston, Elias had made $300 a year. But they were running out of pork, they were running out of flour, and most dangerously, they were running out of gunpowder. "We have to go in," Elias said one morning, scraping the last of the cornmeal into the skillet. Julian looked up, his eyes wide. The weeks of regular food and Elias's steady presence had calmed him somewhat, but the frantic energy still simmered beneath his skin. "No, it's too dangerous. If we leave, they'll jump the claim. If we take the gold, they'll rob us." "We can't eat gold, Julian," Elias said, his voice calm but firm. "And we can't defend this place with empty rifles. We go to Hangtown. We bank the dust, buy supplies, and come back. We leave a sign. We mark the boundaries." "A sign?" Julian laughed bitterly. "A sign won't stop a claim jumper." "No," Elias agreed, "but a reputation will. We go in, we handle our business, and we let people know that the Thorne brothers are not to be trifled with." The road to Hangtown. They buried the bulk of the gold, 10 pounds of it, under the roots of the great oak tree, wrapping it in oilskin and marking the spot with a specific arrangement of river stones. They took only what they needed for supplies and a show pouch to deposit, 50 ounces. The walk to the settlement of Dry Diggings, recently and grimly renamed Hangtown after a triple execution the previous month, was a descent into pandemonium. The path was clogged with traffic. Mule trains laden with whiskey barrels struggled up the slopes. Fresh greenhorns in clean shirts, sweating under the weight of useless patent mining machines, marched past with hopeful eyes. Hangtown itself was an assault on the senses. It had grown explosively since Elias had passed through the region. It was no longer a camp. It was a shanty town of canvas, logs, and sheet metal, clinging precariously to the sides of a ravine. The mud in the street was thigh-deep in places, churned by thousands of boots. But it wasn't the mud that defined the town. It was the noise. Fiddles screeched from gambling tents. Hammers banged on anvils. Men shouted prices, insults, and propositions. "Stay close," Elias muttered, his hand resting on the Colt revolver stuck in his belt. They passed the El Dorado, a gambling saloon that was nothing more than a massive canvas tent with a wooden facade. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung from the tent poles, swaying in the breeze. A brass band played a chaotic polka. "Look at them," Julian whispered, disgust curling his lip. "Vultures." The men in the street were a motley collection of the world's desperate. There were Chilean miners in ponchos, smoking thin cigars. There were New York street toughs with brass knuckles. There were aristocratic Frenchmen whose velvet coats were stained with clay. The assayer's office. They made their way to the Wells & Co. Express office, the closest thing to a bank in the territory. The line spilled out the door. When they finally reached the counter, the agent, a hurried man with ink-stained fingers and a visor, didn't even look up. "Deposit or shipment?" "Deposit," Elias said. He placed the heavy leather pouch on the brass scales. Thud. The sound. The silence. The agent stopped writing. The men in the line behind them stopped talking. The scales' arm dipped sharply, hitting the bottom with a clang. The agent looked up, his eyes assessing them. He saw the worn clothes, the calloused hands, the confident posture. 52 ounces, the agent said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. "High quality, river placer, rough grain." "Credit it to the account of Elias and Julian Thorne," Elias said loudly, turning slightly to face the room. He wanted them to know the gold was gone, locked away in the iron safe behind the counter. "And we'll take a draft for $500 in coin." The agent scribbled a receipt. "You boys struck a pocket?" "We do all right," Elias said vaguely. "Just hard work?" As they gathered their coins and receipt, Elias felt the eyes on his back. They weren't just curious, they were calculating. He saw a man in the corner,
A dandy in a silk vest with a toothpick in his mouth leaned over and whispered to a massive, scarred brute standing next to him. "Let's move," Elias said, grabbing Julian's arm. The cost of living. They went to the mercantile to buy their lives. The prices were a testament to the gorging that defined the gold rush economy. Flour, $1 per pound. Eggs, $3 each. Pickaxes, $15. Whiskey, $20 a bottle. Laudanum, $10 an ounce. "We need boots," Julian said, looking at his toes poking through the leather, "and ammunition." They bought the best boots available, heavy Russian leather that cost $100 a pair. They bought 20 pounds of gunpowder, lead bars, and percussion caps. As they were loading their pack mules, rented for the day at an exorbitant rate, a shadow fell over them. "Heavy load for 2 men," a voice purred. Elias turned. It was the dandy from the bank. Up close, he smelled of lavender water and stale cigar smoke. His eyes were cold, like polished agates. "We manage," Elias said, stepping between the man and Julian. "I'm Josiah Reed. I run the Golden Garter just down the way. I also facilitate investments." "We're not interested, Mr. Reed. We're miners." "Everyone is an investor, Mr. Thorne. Some invest labor, some invest capital. I invest in protection. You see, the roads out of Hangtown are dangerous. Bandits, Murrieta's gang, Indians. A productive claim like yours, it would be a shame if something happened to the operators." "We have our own protection," Elias said, tapping his revolver. Reed chuckled. "A Colt is a fine tool, but it only holds 6 shots. My organization, we have many more than that." "We're not interested," Julian snapped, his voice high and tight. "Get away from us." Reed's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Of course, freedom of choice is the American way. But remember, the wilderness is a lonely place. Good day, gentlemen." He tipped his hat and strolled away, his heavy enforcer trailing behind him like a trained bear. "He'll follow us," Julian whispered, his hands shaking as he tightened the cinch on the mule. "He won't follow us today," Elias said. "He thinks we deposited everything, but he knows who we are now." Judge Lynch. Before they could leave town, a commotion erupted near the hanging tree, a massive oak in the center of the main street. A mob was dragging a man through the mud. The man was screaming, his face a mask of blood. "Thief! Thief!" the crowd chanted. Elias watched, horrified. "What's happening?" asked a man. "Justice," a passerby spat. "Caught him stealing a poke of dust from a tent over on Spanish Hill. No sheriff here, friend. We handle our own." They didn't wait for a trial. There was no judge, no jury. Someone threw a rope over a sturdy branch. A noose was fashioned in seconds. The man was hoisted up onto a whiskey barrel. "Any last words?" a burly miner shouted. "I didn't do it, I swear," he sobbed. "Kick the barrel!" Elias turned away, but he heard the sound, the kick, the thud of the barrel tipping over, the creak of the rope, and the roar of approval from the crowd. It was savage. It was immediate. "Let's go," Elias said, his stomach churning. "Now." They led the mules out of town, pushing through the crowd that was still celebrating the execution. The walk home. The journey back to Dead Man's Gulch was tense. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made them freeze. Elias walked with his rifle unslung, his eyes scanning the ridgelines. They were no longer anonymous.
Here is the English version of Chapter 11, The Miner's Code and the Thief's Law. This chapter details the brothers' defensive preparations, the forging of an unlikely alliance with neighboring miners, and the first tense skirmish with Josiah Reed's enforcers. Chapter 11, The Miner's Code and the Thief's Law. Dead Man's Gulch was no longer a wilderness, it was a fortification. Upon returning from Hangtown, the air in the canyon seemed to have changed.
It smelled less of pine resin and more of impending violence. The illusion of isolation was shattered. They knew they were known. Elias watched Julian work. The trip to town had done something to his brother. The erratic, frantic energy of his gold fever had crystallized into a cold, hard paranoia. Julian wasn't just digging for gold anymore. He was digging in for a siege. He spent his evenings hauling river stones, constructing a chest-high breastwork around their tent and the entrance to the mine. "They'll come at night," Julian muttered, wedging a piece of granite into the wall. "Cowards always come at night." "We need more than a wall, Julian," Elias said, cleaning the barrel of his rifle by the fire. "We need eyes, and we need numbers." The unlikely alliance. The next morning, Elias walked down the creek. About half a mile below their claim, the canyon widened slightly. Here, a group of Chinese miners had set up camp. In the racial hierarchy of the gold rush, the Chinese were often treated worse than the dirt they dug in. They were taxed, beaten, and driven off good claims. But Elias had watched them from afar. They were disciplined, industrious, and they moved with a quiet efficiency that he respected. As Elias approached their camp, work stopped immediately. 4 men picked up pickaxes and held them like weapons. A man in the center, older, with a long queue braided down his back and intelligent, watchful eyes, stepped forward. "No trouble," the man said. His English was heavily accented but clear. "I'm not here for trouble," Elias said, keeping his hands open and visible. "I'm Elias Thorne from the upper claim." The man studied him. "I know you. You are the one who pulled the ox from the mud." "My name is Chen," the man added after a pause. "Mr. Chen," Elias nodded. "You know the town. You know the man named Reed." Chen's expression darkened. "The man with the diamond rings. His men came here last week. They kicked over our rice. They told us to pay a tax or leave." "They told us the same," Elias lied slightly. The threat had been more direct, but the sentiment was shared. "They want the whole canyon. They want my gold, and they want your labor." Elias took a step closer. "I have a proposition. The miner's code says every man has a right to his claim, but Reed doesn't follow the code. He follows the law of the thief." "What do you want?" Chen asked. "An alliance," Elias said. "If they come for you, my brother and I will come down the hill with rifles. If they come for us, we need you to flank them." The other Chinese miners murmured amongst themselves, looking uneasy, but Chen silenced them with a sharp gesture. He looked at Elias, assessing the desperation and the resolve in the American's eyes. "To trust a white devil is dangerous," Chen said softly. "To fight alone is suicide," Elias countered. Chen held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "We have a whistle. 1 long blast means a stranger. 2 short blasts means a wolf." 2 short blasts, Elias agreed. He extended his hand. Chen hesitated, then took it. His grip was like iron wire. The bear at the gate. The alliance was tested 3 days later. It was high noon, the sun beating down on the canyon floor, creating shimmering waves of heat. The insects buzzed lazily. "Tweet!" The whistle cut through the air, 1 long blast from down the canyon. Elias and Julian dropped their shovels instantly. They grabbed their rifles and sprinted to the stone wall. "1 blast," Julian whispered, thumbing the hammer of his revolver. "Stranger." Moments later, 3 riders appeared on the narrow trail. They didn't look like miners. They wore tall horses and clean dusters. Leading them was a man Elias recognized from the streets of Hangtown, the massive brute who had shadowed Josiah Reed. The locals called him the Bear. They stopped their horses 30 yards from the wall. The bear chewed on a toothpick, looking at the fortification with amusement. "Afternoon, ladies," the bear shouted. "Doing a little landscaping?" "Private property," Elias called out, sighting down the barrel of his Hauken rifle. "Turn around." The bear laughed, a deep rumble that echoed off the canyon walls. "Now that's not very neighborly. Mr. Reed sent me to check on you. He's worried about your safety. He thinks 2 boys alone out here. Well, accidents happen." "We're not alone," Julian yelled, his voice cracking with tension. "Is that so?" the bear sneered. "I don't see anyone else, just 2 rats hiding behind a pile of rocks." The bear nudged his horse forward. "Here's the deal. You pack up. You leave the dust you've dug so far as a processing fee, and we let you walk out of here with your lives." "One more step and I put a ball in your chest," Elias said. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his hands were steady. The bear stopped. He signaled to the 2 men behind him. They moved their hands toward the holsters on their saddles. "Tweet, tweet!" The sound came from the ridge above them. 2 short blasts. The bear looked up. On the rim of the canyon, silhouetted against the sun, were 5 figures. They held crude muskets and mining tools. It was Chen and his men. Simultaneously, to the left, a rustle in the brush revealed 2 more of Chen's group, leveling a heavy fowling piece at the riders. The bear froze. He looked at Elias, then up at the ridge, back to his men. The odds had shifted. It wasn't 3 against 2 anymore. It was 3 against 10. The bear's smile vanished. He spat the toothpick into the dust. "Well now, seems the rats have made friends with the mice." "Leave," Elias commanded, "and tell Reed that this canyon is closed." The bear stared at Elias with dead, shark-like eyes. "You think this is a win, boy? This ain't a win. This is just the opening bid." He wheeled his horse around violently. "We'll be seeing you." The riders galloped away, disappearing down the twisty trail. Elias didn't lower his rifle until the sound of the hooves had faded completely. He looked up at the ridge and raised a hand in thanks. Chen raised a fist in return, then melted back into the tree line. Julian sat down heavily in the dirt, wiping sweat from his face. "They're gone." "For now," Elias said. He looked at the dust settling on the trail. The confrontation had been a probe. Reed wanted to see if they would fold. Now that he knew they wouldn't, the next move wouldn't be a conversation. "They'll come back with more men," Julian said, his voice trembling with tension. "Then we have to be ready," Elias said. That evening, the canyon felt different. The crickets seemed louder. The shadows seemed deeper. Elias sat by the fire, sharpening his knife. He realized that the dream of the gold rush, the romantic notion of picking up fortune from the ground, was a lie. The gold didn't belong to the one who found it. It belonged to the one who could keep it. He looked at the crude stone wall. It wasn't enough. "We dig deeper," Elias said to the flames, "and we shoot straighter." The clerk from Boston was gone. In his place sat a man who understood the only law that mattered in the territory. The miner's code was just a polite idea. The thief's law was the reality, and the only judge was the gun.